Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the integumentary system, specifically the dermis and an associated layer called the hypodermis. So the dermis is located deep to the epidermis. Epidermis means upon the dermis, so the epidermis is the most superficial layer of skin, and the dermis is deep to the epidermis. So in the picture here we see two different examples of skin, one with hair, one without, but they both contain an epidermis and a dermis. The dermis is a very busy looking layer in these pictures, isn't it? And it does have quite a few accessory structures embedded in there, which we'll talk about in a bit. In terms of its structure, the dermis is made of two types of connecting type connective tissues. Right? In the superficial layer of the dermis, which is called the papillary layer, we find a type of tissue called areolar tissue, which again is a type of connective tissue, and it's the true glue of your body. But the deeper majority part of the dermis contains a type of connecting connective tissue called dense irregular connective tissue. Now, these are connective tissues, which means there's not a lot of connective tissue cells here. There might be some fibroblasts here and there, but there's more extracellular matrix than there are cells. And this is very different than what we saw in the epidermis. The epidermis had layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of cells with some extracellular matrix of lipids and keratin, but not a lot. In the dermis, the majority of what we're looking at is going to be extracellular matrix. So it's going to be collagen protein and elastic protein, and not a lot of connective tissue cells. There will be some fibroblasts because these are the cells that produce the collagen and the elastic protein. The elastic protein gives skin a little bit of flexibility, and the collagen protein also gives a little bit of flexibility, but it does give a lot of strength to skin too. Right? And even though skin is strong and flexible, in this layer we do have pain cells. Okay, so we don't want to go poking and wiggling this around too much. The dermis also, in terms of its structure, contains lots of other things inside of it besides connective tissue. So things that we often refer to as accessory structures, like sweat glands and sebaceous glands and hair. And there's also blood vessels in the dermis. There's quite a few blood vessels in the dermis. It's highly vascularized. That's very different from the epidermis. The epidermis was avascular. And there's also a lot of nervous system cells in the dermis. Some of these are pain cells, like I mentioned, called nociceptors. But some of them are there for our sense of touch and our sense of thermal regulation. The dermis has different functions. Like the epidermis, it is involved with protection, but one of its main jobs is detection. So most of our sensory cells in skin are located in this dermis layer, not the epidermis. So as I mentioned, we're going to have cells here for our sense of touch. We have lots of variations on that. There's deep touch and light touch, for example. But we're also going to detect pain with our nociceptors here. And we will also detect changes in temperature with our thermoreceptors. So all of these cells involved with detection are all nervous system cells. The dermis is also involved with excretion, not a lot, but a little bit. So there are some compounds that are put into sweat, which are excreted to the surface of skin, such as lactic acid and salt. I wanted to mention a special structure of the dermis that fits very well with a special structure of the epidermis. So at the very superficial surface of the dermis, we see these little bumps. They look like little mountains, and we call them dermal papillae. So they're tiny mounds of dermis, and they project into the epidermis. So and if you look closely at the epidermis, at the deep portion of the epidermis that would contact these dermal papillae, we also see little ridges, little upside down mountains. And these are called epidermal ridges on the epidermis. So the dermal papillae fit perfectly into the epidermal ridges. And this is really important because it increases the surface area for connection to strengthen that attachment between the dermis and the epidermis. Right? So the more points of contact that you have between these two layers, the better the attachment. This is kind of the idea behind Velcro too. So this is what keeps our epidermis connected to our dermis. Another application here is that in thick skin on our tips of our fingers and on our toes, the dermal papillae are highly raised, and this is what produces fingerprints. Now, as I mentioned, the dermis does have lots of nervous system cells, and most of these are for sensing things, so we call them sensory receptors. Some of them are involved with our sense of touch, like Meissner's corpuscles are important for detecting light touch, and Pacinian corpuscles are important for detecting deep touch. But some of these sensory receptors are there for detecting changes in temperature. We have hot and cold thermoreceptors that can detect changes in temperature. And then we also have basically what are raw nervous system cell endings that detect things like pain, and those are called nociceptors. Other than sensory cells, though, we have another type of nervous system cell in the skin, and these are called motor neurons, and they are communicating to a muscle located in the skin called the erector pili muscle. And the erector pili muscle is attached to the hairs in your skin, and it causes your hairs to stand on end, what we also call goosebumps. So these motor neurons are what cause that muscle to contract and pull the hairs to stand up. So now I want to take a look at some of the other things that we find in the dermis, so what we can call accessory structures. These include hairs, the roots of hairs called hair follicles, that erector pili muscle, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, and nails. All of these are rooted in the dermis, so they all start in the dermis, but many of these project up through the epidermis to the surface of the skin, right? For example, hairs and the hair follicles are rooted in the dermis, but the hair itself will project up through the epidermis and out to the outside surface of skin. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about hair or hair follicles, and this is because hair doesn't really have a strong physiological function for humans anymore. Same thing with nails. Nails, you can argue a little bit more of a physiological function because they protect your fingertips. I know a couple times I've been slicing something and I did not cut the tip of my finger off because my nail protected me, right? But they don't have a huge role with human physiology, so I'm not going to really discuss these further. The erector pili muscle, I already mentioned, is attached to the hair, causes goosebumps, but again, no physiological function anymore for that. All of those things you could argue have a psychological function, but that's for a different class. I do want to spend some time, though, talking about these glands. Right? So all of the glands in the dermis are exocrine glands. So by definition, exocrine glands usually have a duct, which is a tube that leads off of them. They do not make hormones, so endocrine glands are the ones that make hormones. And they release their substance onto an epithelial surface. In this case, it will be the surface of the epidermis, which is made of epithelial tissue. The skin contains two types of exocrine glands. Sebaceous glands, which produce an oily substance, and then different types of sweat glands, which, as the name suggests, produce sweat. Don't forget that the sebum produced by the sebaceous glands and the sweat produced by the sweat glands, it mixes on the surface of the skin, forming that skin's acid mantle, which also helps to protect the skin. Let's first take a closer look at the sebaceous glands, these oil-producing glands. Right? The sebaceous glands are closely associated with the hair shaft. So they use the surface of the hair shaft as a duct to release their substance onto the surface of the stratum corneum of the epidermis. Sebaceous glands produce a substance called sebum, which contains lipids and other compounds, and it helps to lubricate and protect the epidermis. So you don't want your epidermis to dry and crack, because then that creates an environment that's not a protective barrier, and things like bacteria could invade deeper into the skin and then cause an infection. Now, Sebum is good for us, but sometimes things go wrong with it, and that's what happens with acne. So with acne, what's happening here is the pathway that the sebum follows to get to the surface of the stratum corneum, that pathway becomes blocked, and then bacteria start to grow in or near the sebaceous gland, and the growth of the bacteria there causes inflammation, and that's what we think of as acne. So, acne is highly associated with hormones, and this is because certain hormones do cause the sebaceous glands to produce sebum, and that overproduction of sebum can help to clog that pathway, and that can lead to the acne. The other types of glands found in the dermis are sweat glands, and we have two main types of sweat glands. Merocrine, also known as eccrine sweat glands, and then apocrine sweat glands. Now these names all mean something, but they're very confusing, and some of them were misnamed, so I don't think it's worthwhile to discuss the history of these words here. But let's take a look at the merocrine or eccrine sweat glands first. These are widely distributed all over the body's surface for the most part. They have ducts that discharge directly onto the skin surface, so they don't use a hair shaft or anything like the sebaceous gland did. The merocrine or eccrine sweat glands create what we call sweat, which is mostly water, but it does contain salts and lactic acids and other compounds. And the main function of the merocrine sweat glands is to cool the body. So when this water and sweat is released onto the surface of skin, the heat within the body is used to evaporate that water, and that will draw some of the heat away from the body. So it does help to cool us. The apocrine sweat glands produce sweat, but it's not a cooling sweat. It does not help to cool us down. These apocrine sweat glands are only found kind of in what you think of as stinky places in the body, right? In the axilla, near the genitals, those types of areas. Unlike the merocrine sweat glands, they don't have their own little duct leading to the surface. They're more like the sebaceous gland in that they use the hair shaft to excrete their components to the surface of skin. And what they're secreting is a more sticky, cloudy fluid, unlike the watery, salty fluid of merocrine sweat. So the apocrine sweat is a sticky, cloudy fluid, and the function of it really is nothing. Right? Maybe a long time ago in human evolutionary history, it had a function. Perhaps it was involved with the release of pheromones, and maybe those were used in mating or other types of signaling, but it has no function that we know of now. However, it does have an important application because it makes us stinky. So this is why we wear deodorant, for example. The bacteria on the surface of our skin love to eat apocrine sweat. They think it's just delicious. So the bacteria, for example, in your axilla, in your armpits, they'll eat the apocrine sweat, and then the bacteria produce stinky waste compounds that make you stinky. So basically the bacteria are pooping in your armpits, and that's why you're stinky. These apocrine glands don't really become active until puberty begins. So the hormones that are released during puberty make these apocrine glands start to function, which is why kids start to get stinky when they begin puberty. So that's why it's right before that age or right around that age that schools start to teach them proper hygiene, washing armpits, possibly wearing deodorant, that sort of thing, in order to prevent these bacteria from eating this apocrine sweat and making them stinky. There are other glands associated with the dermis. For example, mammary glands are found in the breasts, and they produce milk. And there are ceruminous glands, which sound really fancy, but these are just in your ear canal, and they produce wax. Before we leave the dermis, I want to talk about something called dermatitis, right? So itis just means inflammation, right? So dermatitis is inflammation of, you'll never guess, the dermis, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the process of inflammation. This is something that comes up a lot in human biology. So there are certain cardinal signs of inflammation, right? When something becomes inflamed, and this is true for the dermis or even something deep inside the body, like maybe in a joint, okay? It becomes warm or hot, right? It becomes swollen, it becomes red, and it can be painful or itchy, and then you usually have impaired use of that structure. So the first three things, hot, swollen, and red, all three of those happen for the same reason. And that's because blood is flowing to that area. So what causes inflammation is usually damage of some kind, right? Maybe you scrape your knee, right? Or maybe you have arthritis in a joint. And the damage, that process leads to signaling for inflammation. And we get that flow of blood coming to the area during the process of inflammation. And the reason why blood is flowing to the area is because blood is bringing healing compounds with it. It's bringing white blood cells that can detect infection, and it's bringing other things that can help the process of healing along. And blood is warm, and blood infuses the area, causing swelling, and blood is red, and that's why you get the hot, swollen, and red signs for inflammation. The pain or itchiness is due to certain compounds that are released during the inflammatory process, right? And the impaired use is mostly just because you have an area that's been damaged and it's painful and you don't want to use it. So different things can cause dermatitis. This includes infection, so you can have like a fungus growing on your skin. It could be radiation, like UV radiation causes a sunburn, and that's a form of dermatitis. It could be mechanical irritation. You know, you went to go slide into second base and you rubbed along the dirt and you have a painful dermatitis, a scratch from sliding. It can be caused by chemicals like from a plant, like poison ivy. Right? And it can be caused by genetics too. So certain gene mutations will make us susceptible to certain forms of dermatitis. So the top picture here, maybe you recognize that, maybe you've seen that before. That's what's caused, the type of dermatitis that's caused by urushiol, which is the compound in poison ivy that causes this lovely, lovely, lovely rash and itching. Right? So the characteristic dermatitis from poison ivy involves a blister and some seepage. So you can see how shiny that is from the blistering and the seepage there. Very, very, very itchy. The other picture is showing a form of dermatitis that actually has a genetic component, and this is psoriasis. So psoriasis has a strong genetic component, and what's happening here, these individuals are overproducing keratinocytes, and the overproduction of the keratinocytes causes keratinocytes to build up, and that just causes damage in the area, and then that causes inflammation, and then hence the dermatitis. The picture over here on the left is that characteristic bullseye that's often seen with Lyme disease. So Lyme disease has a form of dermatitis associated with it, and it's caused by a bacteria that's in the skin. And this bacteria is often delivered by a tick bite. Right? So if you're going outside where there's ticks, make sure you cover up. Lyme disease is not something you want to mess around with. The manifestation of Lyme disease can vary highly from individual to individual, and to the point where it causes nothing and to the point where it causes death. There's a very large spectrum of symptoms associated with Lyme disease, and avoid it at all costs. Now I want to talk about the subcutaneous layer. This is technically not a layer of skin, but it is located just deep to the dermis, so I think it fits well here. The subcutaneous layer is also known as the superficial fascia or hypodermis. Now the word hypodermis is kind of obvious. Hypo, below the dermis. Subcutaneous, sub meaning below the cutaneous skin layer. Right? Superficial fascia, that one's a little bit more complicated. So fascia is just this system of connective tissue found throughout the body. And the superficial is telling you that it's located more superficial in the body. So it's not deep, like between your muscles, but it's closer to the surface. In terms of tissue type, the subcutaneous layer is composed mostly of adipose connective tissue. but it does also contain other connective tissues like areolar tissue, which is a gluing connective tissue. But the adipose tissue is of course full of fat, and this fat can really help with temperature regulation, especially when it's cold out. It helps to keep the heat inside the body. The subcutaneous layer lacks major organs and accessory structures, except with the exception of blood vessels. So there are quite a few blood vessels in the subcutaneous layer, and there are some nerves running through there. It is of clinical significance, and that is because it is used as a site for injecting drugs. So obviously it's easy to inject into the subcutaneous layer as opposed to a blood vessel because it's so easy to access. And we call these types of injections a hypodermic injection or a sub-Q injection, the sub-Q being short for subcutaneous layer. So someone who has diabetes and receives an insulin injection will get that injection into this subcutaneous layer.